Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Andrew Johnson, Part 8, Vindication in Old Age. Tonight we'll wrap up the fascinating life of Andrew Johnson. Early in the year, he was facing an impeachment trial, which if he was convicted, he would be removed from office. As my dear wife Alice said, Andrew Johnson was having conflicts left and right. However, on February 24th, there was a White House reception, and one reporter said that President Andrew Johnson was looking, quote, wonderfully like a man whose mind was at ease and whose conscience did not torture him for the heinous crimes charged against him. Now, the language of his impeachment said that Andrew Johnson had, quote, intemperate, inflammatory, and scandalous harangues. Thaddeus Stevens, a leader among those seeking impeachment, reportedly wanted to punish the South for slavery and secession. He had a romantic relationship with a black housekeeper. And Thaddeus Stevens was terminally ill and determined to drive Andrew Johnson out of the White House before his death. Now, the impeachment issue supposedly was his firing of Secretary of War Stanton, which violated the Tenure of Office Act. However, that was a constitutionally dubious law. It was mostly over conflict over Reconstruction. Thaddeus Stevens said that Andrew Johnson deserved imprisonment, quote, in the penitentiary after criminal proceedings. George Julian, an Indiana representative, said, quote, we are indebted to the stupid rebel malignity of Andrew Johnson for the courage which at last shall hurl him from the White House and consign him once more to the fond embrace of his rebel Confederates and their faithful allies in the North. Andrew Johnson was impeached, or had an impeachment trial. Historian David Stewart wrote, quote, offers of armed support swamped the president. He could have 1,000 men from New Jersey and a regiment of Kentuckians, or 30,000 Virginians, 2,000 from Louisiana, and 100,000 from Missouri. So you could see that Andrew Johnson had support. You know, he had been a common man, and he was very popular with common people all over the country, really. And so this was something to keep in mind, that he did not have all enemies. He certainly did have enemies, but he had support. The impeachment trial was scheduled to start March 13th. President Johnson's defense asked for a 40-day postponement to prepare for the defense. Benjamin Butler said, quote, 40 days, as long as it took God to destroy the world by flood. A 16-day delay was granted. Andrew Johnson said, quote, the American Senate is as corrupt as the Roman Senate. Now, again, there was no vice president. So if this impeachment went through, if President Johnson was convicted, that meant he would be succeeded. The new president would be the president tempore, the Senate president, Benjamin Wade, who was next in line to become president. On May 15th, black churches in Washington, D.C. had prayers asking God for a guilty verdict against Andrew Johnson. Biographer Gary Bullard wrote, quote, the reports, the rumors, the whispers of an angry, inchoate, armed response from the hills and farmlands and tough working-class districts of the cities only naturally unnerved Johnson's congressional foes, many of whom began to imagine unwashed mobs rushing up the steps of the Capitol, smashing their way through the ornate, polished wooden doors of the House chamber, and putting to use the business end of their rifles. Republican Senator John Alexander Logan helped organize a massive Veterans of the Civil War group, which was called the Grand Army of the Republic, 300,000 members. He moved into the War Department, slept on a cot, and was ready to command the veterans to crush these Andrew Johnson-inspired rumors of guerrilla attacks on Washington, D.C. Gary Bullard wrote, quote, Andrew Johnson sincerely believed himself a tribune of the people. He knew them all, the blacksmiths, carpenters, farmers, mechanics. He knew their struggles. He knew their dreams. He knew their disappointments. He knew them because for so long he had shared those same struggles, dreams, and disappointments. Gary Bullard continued, quote, "And the laborers of the country felt they knew him too. Crudely composed letters to Johnson, marked with misspellings from men and women not at all comfortable writing letters, attested to their belief that he cared about them, that he was in the end one of them. That public support gave Andrew Johnson confidence he was doing the right thing." General William Tecumseh Sherman said, quote, "Andrew Johnson is like a general fighting without an army. He is like King Lear roaring at the wild storm, bareheaded and helpless." Nice reference to William Shakespeare. Gideon Welles, one of the cabinet members, liked Andrew Johnson. Gary Bullard said they had a, quote, "shared sourness." Poet Lydia Maria Child wrote, quote, "Was there ever such a braying ass as Andrew Johnson?" Now, Benjamin Brown French, a longtime federal commissioner of public buildings who had known every president since Andrew Jackson, said, quote, "I sincerely believe him to be the most unjustly persecuted man I ever knew, and have an abiding faith that he will come out of the furnace pure gold, undefiled by the wicked and malicious attempts that demagogues and villains are making to ruin him." Andrew Johnson's foes said that Andrew Johnson was needlessly combative and mentally unbalanced. His supporters said that he was strong and smart. Andrew Johnson believed that the common man supported him, and that belief sustained him. He said, quote, "I will perform my duty, let the consequences be what they may." He was a fighter. Gary Bullard wrote, quote, "It was the one sure thing Andrew Johnson knew how to do." Andrew Johnson compared the impeachers with the signers of Charles I's death certificate. William, from the English Civil War, William Groesbeck, an Ohio Democrat, was a lawyer involved in the defense of Andrew Johnson. He had a massive head, hooked nose, projected chin, and he resembled Cicero from ancient Greece. Alexander Stevens urged Andrew Johnson to conduct his own defense, which he did not do. On March 30th, the opening arguments took place in the impeachment. Ben Butler of the prosecution was noted for his notorious histrionics. There was a big crowd in the galleries, ladies in their finery, foreign diplomats, and distinguished guests. Now this Ben Butler said, quote, "By murder most foul did Andrew Johnson succeed to the presidency and is an elect of an assassin to that high office, and not of the people." Now President Johnson waited in the White House. He was impatient for news from his attorneys. George Boutwell said that Andrew Johnson should be banished to the black hole in the southern sky. Thaddeus Stevens was too weak to finish his summation and asked Butler to finish. On March 23rd, President Andrew Johnson had a reception for Congress at the White House. Some attended to see how, quote, Andy was taking it. They hoped that he would appear and have anxiety, and they were disappointed that he appeared calm and dignified. Now, during the impeachment trial, Andrew Johnson was busy with his regular routine, visiting sick servants, weddings, and funerals. He attended the Presbyterian Church on New York Avenue in Washington, D.C. He also attended Catholic Mass and enjoyed one homily regarding the struggle of the poor against the aristocracy, and that stimulated him. Andrew Johnson believed that the Tenure of Office Act was unconstitutional, and Stanton himself opposed that law. Andrew Johnson cited the Bible, 1 Samuel 12:3, and he said, quote, "Behold, here I am, witness against me before the Lord and before his anointed. Whose ox have I taken? Or whose ass have I taken? Whom have I defrauded? Whom have I oppressed? Of whose hand have I received any bribe to blind mine eyes? And I will restore it to you." In the middle of April, Andrew Johnson was unwell and gloomy. He was moved by receiving an encouraging message. Now, the black people in Washington, D.C. celebrated the 6th anniversary of freedom for Washington, D.C. at that time. On May 5th, Secretary of State Seward bet a basket of champagne that Andrew Johnson would be acquitted. The Republican senators wanted Andrew Johnson's guarantee that he would stop interfering with Reconstruction, and if he did, they would vote for acquittal. And reportedly, Andrew Johnson agreed. On May 12th, there was big excitement as the Senate was voting on whether he should be removed from office. Now, his successor, the guy who would become the new president, was Ben Wade. He supported the labor unions and the vote for women, which were very radical ideas at that time. The audience in the galleries were warned not to violate the rules of silence or they faced arrest. Now, during the voting, the Democrats voted not guilty, and 7 Republicans also voted for acquittal. The end result was 35-19 for conviction, one vote short of the necessary 2/3, which meant that he was acquitted and would continue as president. During the voting, Andrew Johnson waited anxiously in the White House. Thaddeus Stevens was very disappointed by the acquittal of Andrew Johnson, was carried by his servants out of the Senate and said, quote, "The country is going to the devil." The National Anti-Slavery Standard called Andrew Johnson the Pasha of Assassins. So the acquittal, 7 Republicans voted to acquit. There was a public backlash for some of them. A telegram went to Edmund Ross and said, quote, "Kansas repudiates you as she does all perjurers and skunks." A Kansas Supreme Court justice wrote to this Edmund Ross that the rope that Judas Iscariot used to hang himself had been lost, but Jim Lane offered his pistol. So Edmund Ross said that he voted for acquittal to preserve the balance of power between Congress and the president. Republicans said that the Southerners were unrepentant. Now in 1868, that was an election year. In the fall, Ulysses S. Grant would be elected against Horatio Seymour, the Democrat, who actually won more white votes. And the black vote helped Ulysses S. Grant to win in 1868. Also in 1868, Alaska was purchased from Russia. They called it Seward's Folly. Secretary of State William Seward was involved. It was also called Seward's Icebox and Johnson's Polar Bear Garden. The United States paid 2.5 cents per acre and acquired 7.2 million acres, a real bargain. The U.S. also acquired Midway Island in the Pacific, and there was progress on the Transcontinental Railroad, very good progress. Also, there was a transatlantic cable between North America and Europe. In 1866, there had been a telegram between the U.S. and Europe. Charles Dickens also visited the White House in 1868. Congressional Reconstruction, which became the law of the land, and ended up leading to racial polarization in the South, and some called this an attempt to help black people dominate whites in the South. During Andrew Johnson's presidency, he issued 14,000 pardons, most regarding the Confederacy. In June of 1868, the Republicans had their convention in Chicago, Illinois. Ulysses S. Grant was nominated for president. Andrew Johnson believed that history would give Johnson, credit for, quote, high patriotism and the discharge of his difficult duties at a time of great excitement. After President Johnson was acquitted, Edwin Stanton resigned as Secretary of State, and so this was a victory. People believed the charges against Johnson were weak. Thomas Jenks, a House rep from Rhode Island, said that the charges were, quote, a penny whistle affair. And again, a major factor that a lot of people didn't like Ben Wade, who would have become the new president. Horace White, a journalist, said that evil birds were around Wade. James A. Garfield, who would become president in 1880, said that Wade was, quote, a man of violent passions, extreme opinions, and narrow views. a man who had never thought thoroughly or carefully on any subject except slavery, and surrounded by the worst and most violent elements in the Republican Party. There was also a fear that if President Johnson was convicted, that this would lead to congressional supremacy over the president instead of equality and checks and balances. Why was Andrew Johnson impeached? It was a belief that with Andrew Johnson president, the freedmen in the South would have no rights. Folks in the South prayed for an Andrew Johnson acquittal, at least white people. There were reports in Louisiana that black people were being constantly murdered. Terrible. And when Andrew Johnson was acquitted, there was a celebration among white people in the South and fireworks. Southern Unionists were depressed. There were reports in South Carolina that Unionists were in danger. The Republican members of the state who had been elected to the state legislature had been murdered. John Schofield, the new Secretary of War, became the new Secretary of War, and Andrew Johnson visited the War Department in June. And President Johnson said, quote, "It is a long time since I have been in this room." Andrew Johnson hoped to receive the Democratic nomination for president. He wanted a second term. He was popular in the South. However, he didn't get the nomination. In the first months of 1868, there was a boom for Johnson for president. He gave a new round of amnesties on July 4th. He wanted no exceptions, and he wanted to include Jefferson Davis. He compromised, excluding those who had already been indicted for their involvement in the Civil War, including Jefferson Davis. A group of New Yorkers asked Andrew Johnson to throw his hat in the ring, which he did. However, some believe that he had no party. He disagreed. Andrew Johnson said, quote, "Julius Caesar had a party, and Pompey and Crassus had a party, but the Commonwealth had none." Nice reference to ancient Rome. Reportedly, Andrew Johnson had no chance to receive the Democratic nomination, and Democrats never forgave him for being the running mate of Abraham Lincoln on the Republican ticket in 1864. Also, that he never removed enough Republicans from office to please Democrats regarding patronage. James B. Bingham said that Andrew Johnson would have been the strongest candidate against Ulysses S. Grant, and the Democratic leaders were foolish, that they did not help him during his struggles and kept aloof and gave him a cold shoulder. He was left alone to fight Republicans during his impeachment. The Democratic candidates included Horatio Seymour, the New York governor. The Democratic convention was July 7th, and Seymour was nominated. Thaddeus Stevens compared Andrew Johnson to Julius Caesar, calling him a tyrant, and that they needed Brutus's dagger. After the convention, when this Horatio Seymour was nominated, Andrew Johnson was bitter. Seymour needed Andrew Johnson's support. He approached Johnson, and Johnson agreed to support the ticket. Andrew Johnson continued to express opinion as his opposition to Reconstruction. In June, in the South, southern states except Virginia, Texas, and Mississippi were admitted to the Union, readmitted, and if they ratified the 14th Amendment to the Constitution. Andrew Johnson supported a 1-year, 6-year term for presidents. On August 11th, Thaddeus Stevens died. He'd been the strongest enemy of Andrew Johnson. In the election in November, Ulysses S. Grant won, and Andrew Johnson was disappointed. There were the ongoing Indian wars in the West as well. Indians had killed Captain William J. Futterman and his entire command on the Bozeman Trail in Montana in 1866. In 1867, there was a peace commission, treaties signed with American Indian nations, including the Sioux, and in the Indian Territory, the Arapaho, Cheyenne, Apache, Comanche, and Kiowa, and the Sioux and Crow in South Dakota. Andrew Johnson said that Reconstruction was an attempt to put white people under the domination of black people in the South. There was a Christmas amnesty in 1868. All Confederates, including Jefferson Davis. There was a release of the remaining prisoners involved in the Abraham Lincoln murder who were in the Dry Tortugas in the Caribbean, Dr. Samuel Mudd and Edmund Spangler. On December 30th, Andrew Johnson was 60 years old and vigorous. Charles Dickens met President Johnson on a trip to the U.S. in the White House, and Dickens said, quote, "I was very much impressed with the president's face and manner. It is one of the most remarkable faces I have ever seen. Not imaginative, but very powerful in its firmness, strength of will, and steadiness in purpose." Andrew Johnson celebrated his birthday by hosting a children's party at the White House. 300 children came and met Andrew Johnson's grandchildren. Andrew Johnson loved to play with his grandchildren. He liked to joke with them and ask their opinions on different topics. Andrew Johnson had bought a 350-acre farm 6 miles east of Greenville, Tennessee. He had 2 flour mills. He liked to amuse himself feeding mice in the White House from milled grain that he had milled. Andrew Johnson continued to respect Secretary of State Seward. Seward helped get the French out of Mexico, also helped purchase Alaska and Midway Island in the Pacific. He attempted to buy the Danish West Indies, but failed. He also signed a treaty with China. President Johnson enjoyed receiving the colorful Chinese delegates in the White House. In the Civil War, the British were complicit in building the Confederate cruiser Alabama, which inflicted great losses on U.S. shipping. Senator Charles Sumner wanted the British to pay the entire cost of the war after Gettysburg, $2 billion, and he said he would be satisfied if they ceded Canada to the U.S. However, the British did not agree to that. There was speculation about Andrew Johnson's plans. He wanted vindication. Perhaps he would become governor or senator in Tennessee. Andrew Johnson was worried about the March 4th inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant. He decided not to attend Grant's inauguration. Johnson believed that he was fighting an expansive, oppressive overreach of government. In February, he pardoned Samuel Mudd, the doctor who mended John Wilkes Booth's leg, and he ordered the remains of John Wilkes Booth returned to his family. Ulysses S. Grant said that the Tenure of Office Act meant it was impossible to remove incompetent, corrupt persons in government. The last weeks of Andrew Johnson's administration, a crazed woman wandered the White House trying to kill President Johnson. Ulysses S. Grant refused to ride in a carriage with Andrew Johnson to the inauguration. Those two, Grant and Johnson, disliked each other. So there were 2 vehicles prepared. Andrew Johnson did not go. In his farewell address, President Johnson reminded Americans that he had disbanded an army of 1 million men, preserved the peace. But he was out of office as their new president was inaugurated, Ulysses S. Grant. He was ambitious and restless. He was invited to Baltimore, Maryland, March 11th. Again, he did not ride to the Capitol with Ulysses S. Grant. Gary Bullard wrote, quote, "He would not watch Ulysses S. Grant take the oath of office, applaud his inaugural address, or shake his hand in congratulations. Damn the tradition." March 18th, Andrew Johnson departed for Greenville, Tennessee. It was a triumphant tour. He had grand receptions along the way, including Lynchburg, Virginia. He arrived in Greenville 8 years earlier. There had been a banner there on his home that said, "Traitor, traitor." In late March, he was ill. He was bored in Greenville. However, he did recover. In Tennessee, all of the Confederate veterans had been disenfranchised. They could not vote, but all black men could vote. Andrew Johnson saw this as a political opportunity. He went on a speaking tour in Tennessee, and the folks in the crowd said, quote, "That's him. He's the same old Andy yet." 1869, Andrew Johnson's fortune stood at $200,000. He had a 350-acre farm outside of Greenville with 2 flour mills. Again, he left, backing up a little bit, March 18th, he left Washington, D.C., cheered on a southern route in northern Virginia and eastern Tennessee. He was very popular with the people along the route. When he was in Greenville, he said to a reporter, quote, There never has been such a glorious country on the face of the earth, and if we can only get along and patiently bear with each other, all will come out right finally. Andrew Johnson continued, quote, "If North and South understood each other better, there would be no such thing in the way of our being united, prosperous, and happy." Gary Bullard wrote about Andrew Johnson in Greenville, Tennessee, quote, "Front porch ruminations delivered from the comfort of a rocking chair, with neighbors and friends talking about the price of corn and potatoes, weather conditions, and the health of a favored milking cow, could only satisfy Andrew Johnson for so long." In April, Andrew Johnson, 1869, he went on a speaking tour in Tennessee, Knoxville, Murfreesboro, and Nashville. There were excited receptions. In Memphis, he addressed the Irish Literary Association, and he reminded the audience that he had been against the Know-Nothing Party. Now, a disaster happened during this time. His son Robert committed suicide. Very tragic. He had not been able to recover from alcoholism. A bright future had been destroyed by alcoholism. The bereaved Andrew Johnson returned to Greenville. He only had one son left, Andrew Johnson Jr., whom they called Frank, and Frank promised that he would never drink. He was in college at Georgetown. Andrew Johnson wrote a letter to his son Frank and said, "Study well." He sent French stamps for Frank's collection. In Tennessee, there were 50,000 blacks who could vote and 20,000 whites who could vote at that time. Andrew Johnson hoped to be elected to the U.S. Senate. He continued giving speeches. Now, the secessionists and Republicans were against him. The Tennessee legislature voted for Senate in October, and Andrew Johnson lost. He returned from Nashville to Greenville. Regarding Greenville, he said, quote, "It is a dull place and likely to continue so," in a letter to his son Frank. His daughter Mary was unhappy with her husband William and was talking about getting a divorce. Andrew Johnson said that he would rather than have anything like that happen in my family, I would sooner have everything I have sunk in the depths of hell. Andrew Johnson had a new friend, young lawyer E.C. Reeves. Johnson's right arm had not recovered from that train accident, and Reeves helped him with his writing. And Andrew Jackson continued to be his hero. Regarding Greenville, Andrew Johnson said, quote, "This town is as lifeless as a graveyard." Johnson wanted to return to Washington, D.C. He wanted vindication. He wanted to return to Congress. In January of 1870, in Tennessee, there was talk of a poll tax to disenfranchise black voters. Andrew Johnson was interested in returning to the U.S. Senate. In May of 1871, there was an industrial exposition in Knoxville, which Andrew Johnson attended. He gave a speech and reminded the audience that Thomas Jefferson warned of the dangers of big cities. Andrew Johnson was unhappy in retirement. He was bored in Greenville. Eliza was sick. He was depressed. He said, quote, "I am so solitary as though I were in the wilds of Africa. There is nothing of interest in Greenville. All is dull and flat. I long to be set free from this place, forever, I hope." Now, 1872, the U.S. was unsuccessful in obtaining the Dominican Republic. Andrew Johnson traveled to Washington, D.C., and during this was another presidential election year, and Andrew Johnson supported Horace Greeley, the Democratic candidate, against Ulysses S. Grant. And Johnson said he was not afraid at snapping at Grant's heels. He was also campaigning for Congress. Reportedly, in his speeches, he was earnest, quiet, and deliberate. Sincere, had blazing eyes, which were unforgettable. In the House vote, Andrew Johnson lost again, finishing third. In June of 1869, his son, in Washington, D.C., his son had graduated from college from Georgetown. In an interview with the New York Herald, Andrew Johnson criticized Ulysses S. Grant and said, quote, "Why, sir, Ulysses S. Grant's soul is so small you could put it within the periphery of a hazelnut shell, and it might float about for 1,000 years without knocking against the walls of the shell." Andrew Johnson hoped to return to the Senate. There was trouble in 1873, a cholera epidemic in Tennessee, and Andrew Johnson got sick with cholera, and he believed he was near death. He prepared his last statement that he had performed his duty to God and country and family and did not fear death. He was happy to leave his jealous enemies and who were traitors. However, he recovered. He had more life. He had financial trouble. A bank failed. He lost $73,000. Most of that money was recovered later. 4 years after leaving the White House in 1873, Andrew Johnson had been rejected for the Democratic nomination for president in 1872 and defeated in races for the Senate and House. However, he soldiered on. There was a controversy in 1873 that he had not pardoned Mary Surratt, who had been executed by the United States, and there had been a petition for his pardon. He traveled to Washington, D.C. regarding this issue, and the report came out that his cabinet consensus had been that Mary Surratt's being female should not be a factor in whether she was executed or not. 1875 was his last try at the Senate. He was still skillful in politics, hated by the Bourbons and the wealthy and secessionists. He continued. He cultivated the Grangers, National Farmers Organization. Andrew Johnson said that the farmers and industrial workers were the backbone of the country. Millard Fillmore died in 1875. Andrew Johnson praised him, seeking Whig support. Andrew Johnson continued to seek vindication. He was ambitious. He said that ambition was manly and that you were not a man if you had no ambition. Andrew Johnson said, quote, in 1875, George Washington had his Benedict Arnold. Thomas Jefferson had his Aaron Burr. Julius Caesar had his Brutus. Our Savior had 12 apostles. One of them betrayed him, while another denied him. I too had mine. The audience loved his speeches. The Tennessee legislature voted for U.S. Senate. In 1875, Andrew Johnson persuaded Nathan Bedford Forrest to go home. He needed Republican support to be elected to the U.S. Senate, and he won. He was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1875. And Andrew Johnson said, quote, well, I'd rather have this information than to learn that I had been elected President of the United States. Thank God for the vindication. He decided that he would have no banquet to celebrate. The Bourbons were downcast. He went home to Greenville, elected to the U.S. Senate. A commercial newspaper in Cincinnati, Ohio, wrote, quote, with Andrew Johnson in the Senate, we can dismiss all fears for the safety of the Constitution. So, Andrew Johnson was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1875. Gary Bullard wrote, quote, it was unprecedented, improbable, and even a little absurd. But Andrew Johnson, at the age of 66, one of the most derided figures in American history, was back. His victory resulted in amassing estimates at more than 5,000 people who cheered him as he left the Maxwell House in Nashville, Tennessee, to acknowledge his victory in a brief speech delivered in the city's downtown public square. Ulysses S. Grant's reaction, President Grant's reaction to the victory was, quote, I am sick again. Gary Bullard wrote, quote, clearly, Andrew Johnson's win had captivated the imagination of an American public, intrigued with the idea of a former president being returned to the White House by a triumphant vote of the people. It had never happened before. But so many things in his chaotic career had never happened before, leaving the impression that when it came to Andrew Johnson, anything was possible. In 1875, Andrew Johnson was a front-runner for the Democratic Party's nomination for president in 1876. In March of 1875, he returned to Washington, D.C., and March 5th, he gave his last great public address. There was a debate on Ulysses S. Grant's policy in Louisiana, the Army interfering in a disputed election there and removing 5 members of the legislature. Andrew Johnson called this Caesarism or Julius Caesarism. And he said to Ulysses S. Grant, Caesar, disband your legions and restore Louisiana to liberty. The response from the audience was enthusiastic. He remained combative. At his hotel, he played with his grandson, Provost Marshal O'Beirne, on all fours with the boy on his back. On March 22nd, he gave a speech in the Senate, 2.5 hours long, 10,000 words. Frederick Douglass was there, also Phoebe Couzens, the feminist lawyer. Andrew Johnson had a glass of water and half a lemon during his speech. Gary Bullard wrote, quote, The lemon, as any great 19th century orator knew, to be sucked on in order to keep his throat lubricated. 1875, Andrew Johnson could have taken a vacation in the spring. However, he was restless. In June, he traveled to Ohio. By July 28th, he was on a train to the Stover Farm near Greenville, Tennessee, to visit his daughter, Mary. On the train, he met a friend, and they talked. He blamed Edwin Stanton, whom he called the Marat of American politics. He said that after the war, the South had been prostrate and helpless, and some Northerners wanted to kick the dead lion. He wanted to protect the South from the hatred of the North. Andrew Johnson called Stanton the Jean-Paul Marat, the radical French revolutionary. He said that President Lincoln's death was a tragedy for the South. He arrived at the home of his daughter, Mary. He was ready to retire. He visited with his granddaughter, Lily, and had a stroke. His speech became slurred, and his left side was paralyzed. On July 30th, he had his second stroke, and on July 31st, he died at 2:30 in the morning. His body was returned to Greenville, Tennessee, wrapped in the American flag, his head on the Constitution. His funeral was August 3rd. The whole town was draped in mourning, and 5,000 people attended the procession to the cemetery. At his burial, Tennessee Governor James Porter said that Andrew Johnson's life was, quote, full of encouragement, illustrating that neither humble origin, poverty, or want of sound influences in early life present insuperable barriers to the triumph of an indomitable will and free spirit. A Greenville woman put a bouquet of roses and white lilies on his grave with a satin ribbon that read, quote, the people's friend. At his funeral escort, there were the Johnson Guards, Knights Templar, and Freemasons. And President Grant said that he had the painful duty to announce the death of Andrew Johnson. The reaction in the North was to praise Johnson for his loyalty to the Union during the Civil War, and in the South to praise him for his help to the South after the war. On his grave, there was a marble shaft that had the Constitution, the Bible, and an eagle. His home became a national shrine. Andrew Johnson's reputation in the 1920s was up and in the 1960s down. But people acknowledged that his support for the Union meant he was a man of courage. His wife, Eliza, died 6 months after him. In 1878, an obelisk was erected on his grave. In 1906, the cemetery was renamed the Andrew Johnson Cemetery. On the stone marker by his grave, the words include, quote, his faith in the people never wavered. Historian Annette Gordon Reed wrote, quote, to be fair to Andrew Johnson, any man would have had a tough time following Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Johnson had a fiery, from-the-gut, extemporaneous oratory that could whip audiences into a frenzy. Regarding ranking of the American presidents, Annette Gordon Reed wrote, quote, Andrew Johnson is almost always ranked among the worst, if not the worst, the man who botched Reconstruction, who energized and gave aid to the recently defeated enemies of the United States. Annette Gordon Reed continues, quote, the relative lack of Andrew Johnson's voice in personal letters will make him forever enigmatic. Andrew Johnson's life in public service was as much an attempt to exercise personal demons as it was a desire to serve his various constituents or make a lasting mark on the offices to which he was elected. Annette Gordon Reed continued, quote, Andrew Johnson acted as though he had to constantly prove himself to those around him, as if he assumed they were all silently questioning his ability. There was a positive side to Andrew Johnson's stubborn resolution. It gave him the strength to remain loyal to the Union when he could have cast his lot with the Confederates. He faced personal threats and threats to his family and angry mobs as he stood firm on the question whether the United States was to remain intact. Annette Gordon Reed continued, quote, Andrew Johnson eschewed social events, giving the impression that he was hard at work for the common man and had no time for such frivolities. She continued, quote, Andrew Johnson was the poor boy who systematically rose to the heights, fell from grace, and then fought his way back to a position of honor in the country. Only in America, as they say. Jeffrey K. Smith wrote, quote, Andrew Johnson's legacy is unique in many ways. His rise from self-educated, impoverished mudsill to President of the United States represents one of the greatest success stories in American history. As the only Southern lawmaker who refused to join the secessionist movement, Andrew Johnson became the country's most renowned loyalist. Abraham Lincoln said, quote, "No man has a right to judge Andrew Johnson in any respect who has not suffered so much as he has for the nation's sake." Now, for these 8 videos, I read 4 books. The first was Andrew Johnson, a biography by Hans L. Trefus, 1989. Andrew Johnson by Annette Gordon Reed, 2011. Andrew Johnson, The Renaissance of an American Politician by Gary Boulard, 2021. And The Loyalist, The Life and Times of Andrew Johnson by Jeffrey K. Smith, 2012. So in conclusion, Andrew Johnson lived a fascinating life. He came from nothing, very humble background, worked hard, never went to school but became highly educated, and he deserves a lot of credit for his loyalty to the United States and his efforts that helped the United States win the war and keep the United States one country. His efforts to try to keep Tennessee from joining the Confederacy, and then as military governor of Tennessee, then helping the United States win the war against the Confederacy. The major criticism of him could be or should be is the fact that he really did not try to help the freed slaves after the war. And for that, he can legitimately be criticized. But overall, you have to give him a lot of credit. And he was a fighter. He was always fighting people, but there was definitely more good than bad in his life. He did a lot for the United States. God bless Andrew Johnson, a man who served his country well. In the next American history video, we'll start with Ulysses S. Grant, Part 1. That's going to be several months from now. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.